When Barack Obama took to the stage at last week's Democratic convention, he accused his rival Mitt Romney of being stuck in a Cold War time warp. But is that really a reality? And would US foreign policy change that much if Romney was to win the presidential election in November? Professor Geoffrey Garrett is head of the US Studies Centre and Dean of the University of Sydney Business School. Professor Geoffrey Garrett, welcome to the program.
My pleasure.
The latest polls have Obama in the lead, but is the contest still wide open?
Yeah, I really think it's a 50-50 election. Obama has some advantages. You know, the arcane American electoral system, I think it gives him an advantage in terms of the state-by-state counts. The big imponderable, of course, is the US economy, and last week we had jobs numbers that could be read either positively or negatively. I think it's a 50-50 election, but if I really had to put my money down, I'd still put it on Barack Obama.
Obama is campaigning on jobs growth and addressing economic inequality as opposed to Romney's tax cuts. Is Obama's plan resonating with voters?
Well, of course, it doesn't. All the voters don't matter. There's a small number of swing voters in swing states who matter. And what we heard from the Democrats, including Barack Obama, at the Democratic convention last week was a real focus on manufacturing employment, which is a small percentage of the electorate, but a really important percentage in some of those swing states like Michigan and Ohio, which is why the Democrats talked so much about their bailout of the US auto sector last week.
At that Democratic convention, Obama accused Mitt Romney and his running mate of being new to foreign policy, and he also suggested that they'd take America back to the Cold War era. Would Romney really do that?
I don't think he'd do it, but I think it was the right thing for Obama to say. So Obama wanted to shore up his foreign policy credentials, not only in terms of experience, but also toughness. And the big toughness thing, of course, was, I got Osama bin Laden. George Bush wanted to. He could never do it. Mitt Romney's never been in the White House. He wouldn't know how to do it. Talking about Romney taking the US back to the Cold War, of course, Obama is referring to the really tough talk that Mitt Romney has used where China is concerned, but I actually don't think that Romney could be in office the way he's been on the campaign stump when it comes to China, because managing the status quo in the US-China relationship is just so important to the US.
What major changes then, if any, do you think Mitt Romney would make to US foreign policy?
It's such an interesting question. I think at the end of the day, there probably wouldn't be very much difference in substance between a Romney 1 and Obama 2 where foreign policy is concerned. So let's just talk about the two big issues. Romney is talking very tough on China, but I think that in office, as every US president really since George Bush Sr. in the early 90s was, it's really about managing down tensions in the US-China relationship, both on the national security side and on the economic side. So Romney would have to come to the center. But I think we shouldn't forget either that actually Obama has been pretty tough on China. In Canberra last year, he had a very value-laden speech saying that American values weren't just shared by America and the US, they were universal values. He's been talking about getting the South China Sea onto the East Asian Summit agenda with some success. That's a pretty robust policy. And then the other one, obviously not in our region, has to do with Iran. And again, Romney is talking tough on Iran, but I think Obama's pretty tough on Iran too. And really there's a red line for the US where Iran's concerned, which is if it becomes clear that Iran actually has restarted its nuclear weapons program as opposed to producing more nuclear material, then the US would intervene, probably with surgical airstrikes. And I think that would be the position either of Romney or Obama in 2013 and beyond.
If I can pick up on your point about going tough on China, at last weekend's APEC summit, Hillary Clinton probably didn't go as hard on China as the US has in the past, especially on economic issues. Do you think this was a deliberate strategy, considering the presidential election is just around the corner?
Actually, I don't think so, because in Middle America, again in those swing states, talking tough on China is a winning move, and it's a winning move for Democrats as much as Republicans, because we're really talking about job losses in American manufacturing. I think what it reflects is the sophistication of the US-China relationship today, the very high-level dialogues that happen all the time. You know, half the US cabinet travels to Beijing once a year, and half the Chinese Politburo goes to Washington each year. It's a very sophisticated relationship. And, you know, I think the thing that we have to remember here is that what America really is concerned about with China when it comes to the economy is not the exchange rate and not the very large trade deficit that the US runs with China, but rather its market access for American firms in China, particularly American multinationals, and then intellectual property protection for those American firms when they're operating in China. So, yes, currency and trade is the kind of stuff that moves the political dial, but when you get to the real US national interests, it looks quite different.
Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have made it very clear that they want the US to play major economic and security roles in the Asia-Pacific. If Mitt Romney was to win the presidential election, would he continue down the same path?
Well, here I'd give you a yes and no. And the yes would be that Romney would probably end up endorsing Obama's rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific. But I think irrespective of who is the president, the US is going to get, in all likelihood, drawn back into the Middle East, because Iran is the biggest national security problem that the US and the world is facing today. So, yes, in a strategic sense, either Obama 2 or Romney 1 would want to execute this rebalancing to our region. But I'm just afraid that the realities, the sort of day-to-day pressing realities of foreign policy, are going to draw the US back into the Middle East. However, I would say with no likelihood of big US military, ground troop presence the way we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq. The country has no appetite for that. But in terms of real strategic attention, the Middle East is going to loom larger in 2013 and beyond than the rebalancing rhetoric would suggest.
If we can move to the territorial disputes in the Asia-Pacific, the US isn't taking sides, but at APEC, Hillary Clinton warned that the disputes could harm the global economy. If that's the case, should the US be taking sides?
Well, I actually think that Obama had a big win when it comes to territorial disputes, in particular in the South China Sea, which is that he argued at last year's East Asian Summit, just after he was in Australia, that South China Sea was an issue the East Asian Summit should take up. And that was endorsed by all countries and grudgingly acquiesced in by China, which is very different from China's traditional position there, which is to say that all the things that we care about in China are really, it's about our sovereign territorial integrity. And if we're going to talk to other countries about it, we'll do it on a bilateral basis. In particular, China-Vietnam or China-Philippines. Having it in a regional forum, the most important regional forum, I think is exactly what the US wanted, because it doesn't want to be seen to be the bully. It wants to say that there are some rules of the road in economics and rules of the road in national security, and China should play by them. So I think on the security side, having South China Sea and East Asia Summit was a real win for the US, as maybe on the economic side down the road would be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a new free trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific that China would probably want to join. But if China was to join, it would have to make some really big concessions, including on market access and intellectual property, and if that happened, that would obviously be a win for the US, but again, not a bilaterally imposed one.
Professor Garrett, thanks for joining us on the program.
My pleasure as always.